Hello, world. I'm your host, Max Patton, and this is Dreaming Polygons, the podcast where we explore the games industry by interviewing the voices and perspectives shaping its future, one polygon at a time. Today, I'm talking to Yifat Shaik, professor of game design at York University in Toronto, and an experienced exhibitioner and artist working to expand on what we traditionally think of as games. She's done things like the Worksheet Saga, which turns Excel into a video game, and many more interesting projects that redefine the popular notion of games. Let's see what she has to say. Hello, everyone. I am with Yifat.
Hi,
Is that how I say your name?
Yifat.
Yifat. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
First of all, we ask all of our guests the same questions usually, or at least the same first question. In this case, I think it should be interesting because I want to ask you, when did games become a part of your life, and when did you start realizing that they were something that you could do professionally?
Oh man, that's an old story. So I'm old. Oh, I jokingly say I'm old. I'm in my mid-30s, which is ancient in this industry. I started playing games when I was a kid, like most people, but that was like early 90s. I think the first game I ever played was the original Prince of Persia. We didn't have access to computers. I grew up in Jerusalem, so definitely wasn't anything. But I had a friend who had a PC. She was the only person with a PC, and she had all the old point-and-click adventure games, mostly the Sierra ones. I would come to her house and play because my dad had a computer, but it was like a Mac, so we didn't have much there.
That's always been true.
Yeah, I mean, there was a few Mac games were really great, but there wasn't much in games there. I think it was a Mac 2 or something like that. So she had a PC, and I would go to her place and play the PC. I think I was like 10 or 11. And then she moved out to another neighborhood, and we sort of weren't in touch. So I still didn't have a computer, so I really didn't get into games at that point. When there was more internet stuff, I would play Flash game, but I never actually thought about games as something outside of playing solitaire on the computer and stuff like that. It never connected. So eventually I went to art school. I studied animation, 3D animation. And somewhere around the third year, sort of someone gave me a copy of World of Warcraft with the 10 free days. It was Burning Crusade. And I got really into World of Warcraft in the middle of art school, and sort of almost failed art school because of it. Now, at this point, I was like in my mid-20s. So again, not a usual story than most people. And then I finished school. I sort of wandered a bit, worked as a graphic designer for a few years, but really, really got into games in a way that I never thought it was possible. I got really into playing games, obviously still playing World of Warcraft, but I was playing a lot of other games as well. And somewhere a few years later, I just was like, maybe I should do this, maybe for a living. And obviously, Israel at that point, I don't think still has much of a game industry. And I was like, okay, what am I going to do? I had this vogue notion that I want to make games, but I also want to do a master degree. Somehow I ended up in Canada doing a master degree in like an art and technology program. My thesis was about games, video games. Specifically, it was about like the prisoner dilemma and video games and stuff like that. And I think ever since then, it's been a few years now, that's basically what I've been trying to do for a living.
And so it was really going to school and then kind of becoming engrossed in a game, in this case, World of Warcraft, and then realizing later on the power of games that you became attracted to it professionally.
Yeah, it never was a thing until I think my late 20s. I never thought about it as a career, and I never thought about it as something enjoyable until then.
And do you think that part of it was just that before growing up in Israel, it wasn't an environment super friendly to video games? Or do you think it was just an age thing?
I think both. I mean, obviously, there's probably some guys from Israel who tell you a totally different stories. But, Jerusalem, 90s, early 2000, not exactly known for, its technology, high technology output. And a lot of those stuff were just not accessible. Taxes for a lot of technology stuff were really expensive. And my parents were sort of the sort of people who were like, I don't see any, value in video games aside from fun. And I think you can get fun other ways. So it just never was a thing. I think gender was part of it. I think just like the time, I think what at that particular time was accessible and what you could do. I don't think video game was a viable career in Israel until like 3 or 4 years ago.
Real Army Simulator is a game that you partially based off your earlier life experience in Israel because there's mandatory army service when you're younger. So, based off that experience, how did you translate that into a satirical game?
It sort of was a response to when I moved to Canada and everybody thought I was, the main joke was if I can kill them because they thought I was super
Because you were in
tough.
the army, right?
Yeah, and like I was sort of figuring out very quickly that the concept that people have about army and warfare and combat and all those stuff here comes mostly from video games and TV. And it's not to say, oh, video game promote violence, because that's not true, but it's mostly our perception is very different. And obviously, like I wasn't in a combat unit, but even friends who were in combat unit, our experience is very different than what you show in reality. And what I found that actually in many cases, this sort of thing that I was trying to do in Real Army Simulator, which was talking about how the army is not this exciting heroic thing, but it's actually just working in a very, very big corporation and sort of being a cog in the machine, and you have to follow a lot of orders, and some of the orders don't make sense, at least not to you. And I found that the places who do that, who try to show that view, actually comes from comedy. So if you watch MASH or Blackadder or stuff like that, they showed off, they actually were a lot more realistic view of what my army experience or other people that I know army experience was. So that's how the satire came to be. And it wasn't like, oh, I'm going to make the game funny, but it's mostly like, I'm going to make a really boring game about something that's supposed to be really exciting. So in a way, it's a game that is made to troll people in a way.
I've noticed, at least with the art style for sure, right? You mentioned these
Yeah.
big blockbuster games and movies have trained us to think that like warfare or not even war, the military. If you're in the
Yeah.
army, it means you're like a soldier in Modern Warfare and a Call of Duty game. Whereas your game, if you just look at it, and there'll be a link in the description, people can check out the art style. It's very quirky and cartoony. It's not what you would expect.
Yeah, it's also very pink. Which was not originally a thought, but the more when I started working on it, it just became very obvious it's going to be very pink and very feminine. For one thing, because I'm a woman,
Right.
right? And my game was about my experience had a lot. Some of the experience described were specifically for being a woman, not so much like any sexism and stuff like that, but conversation that other women soldiers will have with each other, and guys might have a totally different experience. So yeah, it's very feminine and it's very pink and it's very cartoonish. A lot of games that deal with warfare and army and combat are very gray and realistic and muscular, and I was trying to do something completely different in a way.
Yeah, and I think it works. It hasn't been released yet, but there's been coverage of it before, and people seem to be really intrigued by this because it's such a different experience from what you would expect in a military game.
Yeah, I get a lot of like people get mad at me sometimes. Usually people who aren't in the army, where I'm like, they find the game boring, and my idea was like, that's sort of the idea.
Right, like Papers, Please came out a few years ago, and that's not exactly what most people would call a fun game, but it's still a very good experience, right? You're checking all the people that come across the border, and it's supposed to be mundane and kind of show you how
Yeah,
ridiculous it is. That's the point.
yeah.
And I think it's one of the things that games can really do quite powerfully, making the player bored. And then another way you kind of expanded what we think of as games is the Worksheet Saga, which is this mathematic game of life based off math and genetics. You recreated that in Microsoft Excel, and that sparked some buzz when it came out. Most people would not think of a spreadsheet software as a canvas for fun and experimentation. So, what inspired you to make a game from that?
So that's another complicated story because all my games come from a complicated story. So I teach in university. I teach game design. I would say one of the first few weeks we do an exercise about creating emergent gameplay, which is basically games that the players and the player action dictate where the game will go versus other games where the designer decides where the player will go. In order to create an emergent gameplay, a lot of the time the easiest way is basically using very simple rules to create very beautiful results. And the game of life is, if people are aware of it, it's a mathematical equation trying to simulate life. And it actually has like 4 or 5 very, very simple rules. And when you set up these rules and you press a button because it's a simulation, this beautiful, very beautiful results show up from a very, very simple abstract thing. The idea is always to try and get that, but take away the simulation and make it into a more game. Obviously, it sort of will always fall into toy category, but that's another story. And I really kind of was interested in exploring that concept more. But also, the reason why I did with Excel is because that's the main tool game designers use. So a lot of the stuff that people, especially as someone who teaches, a lot of stuff I get from people is, there's very excited, especially with students, it's very exciting. I want to be a game designers, and they don't really know what it means. And if you look at, especially AAA and stuff like that, a lot of the tools that they use is game designers specifically, they use Excel and they use Word and they use PowerPoint. They don't use anything more exciting than that. So I wanted to go back to what is like how we design a game and go back to this tool that we don't think is particularly exciting, but that's where a lot of our games are being created and designed. Obviously, similar to Real Army Simulator, it's not the most exciting of games. And in a way, it's also not the first game that was made in Excel. There's a few, can't remember his name right now, and I know he follows me on Twitter, so I feel bad about it. But there is a guy who made a full-on RPG in Excel. So it was basically just to experiment and sort of go back to the idea of how we design games and the tools we use to design games.
So what you were doing is really breaking down the game design, because
Yeah.
at the fundamental level, game developers are just using software like this because that's what games are mechanically. Like, this is why it's kind of interesting when people say like, "Oh, I don't care about game graphics. I don't care about visuals, or I don't care about cosmetic microtransactions or any of that." I think it's kind of a silly argument to make because games are really visual. I mean, they're audio experiences too, but I guess they're audio visual, right? They're not a game is not just a mechanical thing. And even your Excel spreadsheet game, I think, is, more than just numbers, because you have the colors and you have the big display going around, and that still makes it a game. So I think it's really brilliant what you've done, breaking a game down into its simplest elements, and I think showing in that process how essential those elements are.
Not that I'm going to compare it to any larger game, but in a way, if you look at, if I made this game and turn it into a 3D game in a game engine, I easily get something like Minecraft. Minecraft, at least in the core, it's a few very simple rules and a few very simple graphics. And when they're joined together, they create something exciting. But the Worksheet Saga will never be as interesting as Minecraft, because first of all, there's the limitation of Excel itself, but also you're so dependent on the program, you're so dependent on the visuals that the program can provide. You can't really add a story, you can't really add sound. I mean, maybe you can add sound to Excel. I haven't tried that yet. It's never going to be the same exciting, but at the end of the day, if you look at at our work as game designers, this is how it's going to look until someone puts it in the game engine.
It has to be appreciated at a different level, because you're right, you can't appreciate the same about Minecraft. And people will say, "Oh, Minecraft's very simplistic," and they're right. But at the same time, even a game like Minecraft has a lot of effort put into the textures and models and art style. Those are things that matter a lot, and I think you learn to appreciate even more when you make them really simple. So you also did Reblink, and that was an augmented reality art exhibit from the Art Gallery of Ontario, which you worked on. What was it like redefining the art viewing experience for that?
What I had to do was take 2D images that was painting in the Art Gallery of Ontario and create it into a 3D object and create a story around the 3D object. And that was a totally different experience than, let's say, doing something like Real Army Simulator or Reblink, because the Worksheet Saga was about taking something that in potentially is beautiful and 3D and exciting and and breaking it down to this most elemental basic component. Reblink was the exact opposite. It's taking something that is 2D and all beautiful, but not exciting to a lot of people unless they really into appreciating art, and making it exciting and 3D and technical and new, and adding elements to it that didn't exist before. So it's an interesting experience. Obviously, I didn't have specific creative input because I wasn't hired, at least not for the stories that were chosen or the painting that were chosen. So most of my creative input was the creation of the actual objects, which was, again, an interesting experience, and trying to figure out how to translate this 2D model into something that can look good in all sides. Because, again, I don't know how this guy, let's say, the first one I did was like a Galileo painting, and I don't know how Galileo looks from the back from that painting. I only have the front. So I have to sort of figure out how everything attaches together and everything looks from the back, how his hair falls down. So it was a really interesting project, and in a way very, very different from everything else I've done. But yeah, it's hard for me to say anything specific about the intention, aside from the sort of trying to make art more accessible to people who go to the art gallery, and making art more exciting, which is always weird for me because I think art is exciting as it is. But yeah.
Yeah, it seems kind of intimidating what you were mentioning, having to, imagine the back and sides of Galileo, or turn these 2D paintings that are really famous into 3D images. That sounds kind of like, is there any kind of pressure in doing that?
I mean, yes, because it's a lot of, you really need to understand how body works and how hair works and anatomy and all those stuff that makes 3D work. Where as an artist, and that happens like when you do it, when you look at a 2D drawing and you translate it to 3D, in the most basic level, a lot of the parts will just be a little bit distorted, because the painter drew it in a specific way that will have, like, they wanted depth, so the arms might be huge, and the moment you put it in 3D, suddenly the arm is huge, and you sort of have to figure out how to make the arm not huge anymore so it will look somewhat realistic. So there's a lot of pressure of trying to understand how a thing works. It's very hard. I mean, I think, and I've been doing this for 10 years as a 3D modeler. It took me 20 something hours for each model of a painting. I did like 2 because I wasn't available for anything else, but the other 3D modeler I know had the same issues. It's a lot of work. It's very challenging work. It looks great, but I don't think people understand how much work it was just to translate this one drawing into a viable 3D object.
And it's going to be really interesting with augmented reality more so in the future. Even in the present, things
Yeah.
like this are cool. But I think what you mentioned, this opportunity to get people engaged in art, because not everyone immediately sees a painting as exciting, is really cool.
Yeah.
And at a broader sense, also, I think augmented reality can get people into video games specifically, because augmented reality can really make that more accessible if you're a person. Like, if you look at everyone who played Pokemon Go last year
Yeah.
and the year before that, or if you look at Apple going to a GDC this year and talking about ARKit, which is kind of a mind-boggling thing. All of these big companies are kind of getting involved in augmented reality because I think they realize how important it is in terms of expanding gaming and its audience.
Yeah, and I take my parents as an example, right? My dad is already 70, I think, and my mom is nearing 70. And while they're quite good with technology, they haven't played computer games. They have no interest. My mom plays solitaire. My dad, like, I explain to him what I do and he nods, and, that's our conversation about it. And for that, and they can't understand VR, for example. They don't feel comfortable with VR. But something like AR is very simple. They don't need to do anything else but use their phone, which they know how to use generally, and just like discover this new exciting thing. I think AR has a lot of potential to be a huge success. I think a lot more than VR. Sorry to all of my VR friends.
Well, VR, even if, I mean, I think VR has potential too, but we're still farther from it because VR is more ambitious. Immediately, yeah, you're right. It's not because like right now you need to put on this headset and this clunky wire, and even though AR isn't exactly streamlined, it's still like you mentioned a lot better just needing a phone.
Yeah, I mean, look, Reblink, you go to the museum, you download an app. It works in all the phones, and you just put your app in front, like use the app, put it in front of the picture, and you got it. It's really simple. Where, VR, yeah, you have the headset, they're expensive. Some people get motion sickness. They're really heavy. Like, I can't wear like the Vive is really heavy for me. I can't wear it for long stretches of time because I'm not a big person, and it was built for bigger guys, right? So I'm like, not that I don't think VR has a lot of potential.
In terms of accessibility, AR definitely wins out. And I think a really telling moment of that
Yeah,
was I think it was Apple that was doing a conference and they had someone from Epic Games demonstrating virtual reality. And the person demonstrating it, she had an unfortunate accident where she
yeah.
tripped over a cable or something in the middle of it on stage. And I felt like really bad for her. But I think that's kind of a really good way to describe VR right now. It's awkward no matter how you do it.
I got stuck in many walls while doing VR.
Yeah, it's not exactly a streamlined, easy process at the moment. So, as a professor of game design, which is your main job, and a frequent observer and commentator on that game design, what do you see as some interesting design trends in mainstream games that you could see emerging in the near future?
So I talked about it before, where this year was very interesting, where a lot of smaller games or a lot of games that were not expected to be huge successes were huge successes. And a lot of games, usually it was, a AAA company will take out their $60 game, will earn, a few $1 million a year, cover their expenses, and will continue to do that particular genre. And this year was really interesting in a way that this wasn't working anymore. There was a lot of failures this year, big AAA failures, and there was a lot of
Hmm.
big successes that were not expected, even though it came from like big companies, something like Horizon Zero Dawn, or even Breath of the Wild. In any other year, there would have been a huge risk. There were a
Hmm.
huge risk. And they were still successful. Obviously, I think what is happening more and more is because indie is doing interesting stuff and people are buying indie and the indie is making a lot of money. I think a lot of companies are looking and saying, oh, we can do this. We can do slightly, we can sort of break our formula. And it's not like, Ubisoft or something will stop making open world game, but they can make open world games that break their usual formula of open world game. I think that there's an interesting trend going on in games. We'll see where it takes us. But there's less fear of doing, something weird. I guess this industry is maturing.
Yeah, well, there was backlash this year to monetization in that a lot of the way a lot of these AAA games do it, like Battlefront with loot boxes, that became very unpopular this year. And like you mentioned, the Horizon Zero Dawn, Breath of the Wild, those big open world games, which continue to be successful. But then you saw like the Switch, and that really changed things for indie games as well, letting older games both, succeed if they haven't been so successful before, and these newer games come to the scene and explode because people had this new console and didn't have much to play on it.
I mean, I think the Switch was the biggest thing that happened this year in 2017 in terms of the stuff that comes out and what you can do, and the fact that, people will buy a $60 game if the $60 game is good. And they will buy the DLC. And it's the same with like non-Switch game like Horizon Zero Dawn. There wasn't any, and it wasn't that they're perfect. Like I have critique about Horizon Zero Dawn in terms of gameplay, but they just gave you a game with a really interesting story and some really interesting combat. And there's obviously a lot of work done on it, and it's done by AAA. It's not a huge company, the company who made it. And that was a huge success because they never asked for anything. It was like, here's a really good product, play a really good product. Same with the Switch, where a lot of other games, loot box is not the issue in a way if the game is good. People will still pay money to get loot box in Overwatch. Because A, the loot boxes don't really change the gameplay, and two, because it's part of the fun. I mean, Overwatch is a fun game. It's a well-made game, with or without the loot boxes. Battlefront, well, not a bad game, but as far as I know, I haven't played it, was so dependent on that monetization that people were like, well, it's not fun without it. I'm not going to play. You haven't given me the full product. Instead, I can buy, I don't know, Cuphead for $20 or something. I don't know how much Cuphead costs, but a small indie one. And that will give me a lot more fun and all the excitement without like having to pay extra for extra stuff.
I think people realize, like, if I'll talk to my friends, and it seemed like a lot of my friends who are into more mainstream games would say before, oh, what's the value of these shorter games? A lot of the time being indie, when I can get this, this grind fest of a game and play it forever, because from a value perspective, that makes more
Yeah.
sense. But I think people in general this year started to appreciate games that were just more simpler and more fun.
I think it's also because we're all getting older. I don't have time to play a 60-hour game. I have time to play a 10-hour game, and so I would play the 10-hour game. In a way, I completely understand where the loot boxes and all those sort of money stuff come from. It's because games are, at least a AAA game, is becoming too expensive to make. Because people are expecting, and that's that's in a way also the fault of the gamers themselves. You're expecting, you want this insane high fidelity, while having this amazing gameplay and having all of that. Well, you can, while not waiting 5 years for your game, but waiting 2 years. And so the current way this particular way of making games is not going well, because games cannot be $60 games anymore.
There's a lot of inefficiency in AAA. Like, if
Yeah.
you just mentioned Cuphead, $20, that's a complete experience. And like, arguably you're right. These AAA games are more ambitious, but they're almost guaranteed to sell well. And I think the problem that these AAA publishers realize is they spend so much money on, in some cases, unnecessary marketing. And there's a lot of, I mean, I don't want to go into it too deeply because, I mean, I'm an armchair observer, but it seems like there's a lot of inefficient practices that could be shaved off given how much these games are already selling. And I think that's why people got more tired of it this year.
It's basically, and I think that's an interesting case in this industry, and that's in India as well. All games are failures because the cost isn't worth sometimes what you make of it. So, Cuphead made a lot of money, but the guys who made Cuphead had to mortgage their house, and it took them 5 years to make the game. In order to pay, and that's a similar problem, by the way, in film, in special effects. Games are not financially viable as people think they are. Salaries in games are not as high as people think they are. They're quite low, actually, at least in Canada, but I'm quite sure in the US. Burnout is very fast. You need a lot of hours to make them. I think the model of making games has to change. Again, there's a lot of redundancies. There's a lot of procedures that you have to go through. The code is always a problem. The way they hire, and again, that depends on the company, but where you have stuff like crunch or certain hours, that means you can, you hire the 20 years old just out of school, because when you're 20, it's easier to crunch. The 30 something years old who have a family is not going to crunch, and they're also not going to enjoy a 50K salary. They want much more money, and so they will leave the industry. And so the people with experience leave the industry. There's a high turnover. You have to train all those people. There's all this stuff going on, and I think like we need to change the way we make games to make them a much more viable industry, because right now making a game means you're going to lose money, whether it's indie or AAA.
Right. Maybe we need to make games shorter but more quality. I mean, it's easy for me to say that, but there's definitely a lot of problems with making games that make it so difficult. You mentioned that you're in your 30s and that's old in this industry, which
Yeah,
is
I
crazy, right?
mentioned.
But ending on a positive note, I want to talk about, you are in your 30s and you're in the games industry and you teach about games. What keeps you in this industry? What makes you optimistic about it?
I mean, for me, I just really liked making games. It took me specifically a really long time to find that thing that I enjoy doing. Like, I learned animation. I hate doing animation. I like, we talked about it. I like procedurality. I like systems. I like all those stuff. So for me, it was just like everything I ever want to do is in this thing. I'm also really lucky in a way because, people piss on academia and, teaching, there's always the saying, if you teach you can't do, or whatever other stuff people do. But academia pays better than working. Obviously it depends where you which university and what field you are, but if you're like me in games and you do the more technical side of game, I earn a decent salary working not a lot of hours. And the thing academia lets me do is I can experiment and I can make weird stuff. I can make something like the Worksheet Saga without having to worry about making money.
And you don't have to crunch.
Yeah. And like, it hasn't, it's not like I don't have that dream of working in AAA, but I don't know if I'll fit there anymore.
Because of the culture.
Yeah, I think I probably will fight with everyone. Just because I've gotten used to being independent at this point.
Right.
Very clearly. I think, again, and I'm very lucky, I also live in Toronto, and Ontario in general has quite a lot of funding for games. That's why we have such a large and very active indie scene. Because there is OMDC that gives money, and there's OEC, and there's TAC, and all those government funding that gives us money to make games. So I can continue in my 30s making games and being an indie, and also maybe have a family and have kids and not having to worry about, the crunch and the long hours and the making enough money to sustain myself. But I'm very lucky. I'm also, I mentioned it in another talk. I'm upper, my parents are upper middle class. I'm an only child. If I have any problem, I can call my parents. I rather not do it for obvious reasons, but I have a safety net, so I can do it in my 30s. Not everyone can do that. And that's another thing the industry needs to start figuring out, like, how do we retain people? If you look at the older generation, the people who made games in the 90s and the 2000, like the late 90s, there are not a lot of them left. And not, they didn't die or anything. They're just like, I'm tired. Why do I
Right.
need to be in this industry anymore? I have a family. Let me find a job that will pay me more money for less work.
Hmm.
So, John Romero is still making games, and, Brenda Romero is still making games, and a few others. But who else?
Everyone else either retired or moved
Yeah,
on. Yeah.
yeah. Or they teach.
Yeah.
And so I think there's like this weirdness in this industry where we have to understand, people say, oh, you're in your 30s, your creativity. I've never been as creative in my 30s. I'm far more creative and interested in my 30s than I've ever been in my 20s. My production, the stuff I make, I'm faster, I'm more interesting. But I also am not going to work for, 30K a year, right? Because
Right.
I'm not. And so it's never we have to think about how to retain people. And obviously, like, now it's changing because, people in the creative directors and stuff like that are, people in their late 30s, early 40s a lot of the time. But if you look at the people who've been in here for a really long time in this industry, not a lot of them stayed in the industry. And that's a shame. And I think, if you compare it, let's say, to film, people make film when they're 90 years old.
George Miller, the guy who
Yeah,
did Mad Max Fury
that's
Road,
exactly
right?
the example.
Yeah,
He's in his 70s or 80s, and he made Mad Max Fury Road. He was 80 years old or something like that.
right. Yeah, him and his wife, yeah.
Yeah, do you see it in games? No, I can't see it happening.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I guess that you mentioned John and Brenda Romero, but that's just such an exception,
Yeah,
people at the top who are already really successful. And that's hard in games because like I think games are still so fast moving where like it's
yeah,
harder to be successful for a long period of time. Like you have the people who made their money in the early PC days, like Romero,
yeah,
or the people who made their money in mobile because
yeah.
there were a lot of people like that, or people who made their money on Steam and maybe people who are making fortunes now on Switch. But how long is that going to last? In movies, you don't have this thing where, oh, every like 5 or 6 years, we're going to move to a new platform. But in games, you do.
Yeah, like movies. Also, movie takes a few weeks to make.
Well, to
Maybe
film,
Lord
but
of
it takes longer to edit and do effects and everything.
Yeah, but like, Lord of the Ring was the only movie that really took like a few years. But most film, like even with special effects and stuff like that, big budget special effect movie will take about a year to make. Where a game will take, the minimum is 2 years to make a game. The only industry that is in has the same problem is animation, by the way, where it takes a few years to make a animated movie. And so we want to move fast, but you started your game 4 years ago, and now the technology is completely different, right?
Hmm.
Or Steam is no longer a viable choice. We'll have to think about it one day.
Right. It's a difficult question for sure. But you're still in this industry. I want to end on a somewhat happy note. People want to follow you. People want to learn about your insights into games. Where can they do that? And where can they check out your games?
My name, just if you Google my name, I think I'm the only person alive with my name, so I'm really easy to find. Yifat Shaik, Twitter is Yifat Shaik, my website is yifatshaik.com. Very, very easy to find. I'm relatively active on Twitter, so it's usually the best way to contact me. Don't contact me on Facebook, I won't answer. But yeah, it's pretty easy to contact me. Sometimes, I'm too busy to obviously talk, but I have opinions on the internet and I will say my opinions on the internet usually. So it's not hard to not find me. I also have a company called the Really Serious Game Company. We just recently went incorporated. So if you follow them, we'll have updates about upcoming games that are made through that company. So Real Army Simulator and a few others. But yeah, very easy to find. And if you Google me, the only other person you can find is maybe my dad. So,
That's nice.
yeah.
I wish I had that search engine optimization. Thank you again for coming on. And for everyone, those links will be in the description. So don't worry if you didn't catch those. And once again, thank you for listening to this episode, everyone. It was a longer one, and probably a tougher one to edit. But it was fun. We had a
I
few
do talk a lot.
but also we had some technical difficulties and stuff. But we got over it, and we see the sunshine now. Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
That's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, feel free to review us on Apple Podcast or Google Play, and any feedback you want to give us is also much appreciated. You can subscribe to us in basically every podcast app, and of course on YouTube as well. There's also Twitter, which you want to follow to stay updated on new episodes of the show. Our Twitter is at PolygonsFM, and don't worry, everything will be linked in the description in case you didn't catch it. Thank you so much for listening to the end of our 7th episode, and I will see you with a new guest next week. Until then, goodbye, world.